I'm John DiIulio. I'm going to be moderating this panel. Can you all hear me, or is it frighteningly? It's like the voice of God, isn't it? I want you to do service. There you go. I'm not going to go into detailed bios. I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists and then ask them to give 3 to 5 minutes or so of opening comments, because we want to do a little cross-laced discussion. We're a very intimate group here. And then we can take some questions from the audience as time allows. We're going to try to wrap up around 4 o'clock or so, maybe a little after. So here we go. Let me just quickly introduce, starting right on my left here, Sister Catherine Sissy Core, who's the Executive Director of Notre Dame AmeriCorps, which she helped begin in 1994 and has watched grow ever more steadily. Thank you, Sister, and I loved your stuff there, and especially the work with mentoring children of prisoners, and that's fantastic. Sitting next to a sister is Rabbi Marla J. Feldman, who is the Director of the Commission on Social Action of Reform Judaism, which facilitates the public policy and social agenda of the Reform Jewish movement. It's wonderful, Rabbi, to have you here, a fellow Penn alum. Right. Here, here. Wasn't Amy Gutman the best on that panel? She was great. I'll tell you, there's no comparison at all. Next to the Rabbi, we have the Mayor, Mayor Stephen Goldsmith, former two-term mayor of Indianapolis, former district attorney in Marion County for 12 years, presently, among other things, a professor at Harvard University. Please do not hold that against him. Also, the chairman of the Corporation of National and Community Service, was an advisor to George W. Bush in 2000, a chief domestic policy advisor, and also served the president on faith-based and not-for-profit initiatives. And Steve, it's always an honor to be with my good friend, Steve Goldsmith. Sitting next to Steve is Dr. Ibo Patel. He is the founder and executive director of Interfaith Youth Corps, which is based in Chicago, an international nonprofit which is working to build mutual respect and pluralism among religiously diverse young people by empowering them to work together to serve others. And if you have not somehow seen this work and the things that he's doing and the books that he's written, I couldn't urge you more strongly to do that. It's just extraordinary. And last but not least, Mr. Timothy P. Shriver, who is the chairman of the board of Special Olympics, where he serves 2.5 million Special Olympics athletes and their families in more than 180 countries. He's really helped to transform the Special Olympics in powerful and important ways. And before the Special Olympics, he was and remains a leading educator focusing on social and emotional factors in learning. And Tim, it's a real honor to have you with us as well. So let me just make a quick statement. We're talking about faith and service. And I'm not going to shill for the faith-based community. That's what I normally would do at this moment. But here's what I'm going to tell you, and ask each of our panelists in the order introduced to give us 3 to 5 minutes. I used to go around in the early 90s when you'd say faith-based and people, you get sort of blank stares. I used to say, well, they said, well, what are you talking about? And I'd say, well, look, imagine that tomorrow morning you woke up and there were no churches, synagogues, mosques, or other religious nonprofit organizations where you live in your community. What would happen? What do you think? How do you think you would know it? Would it just be that on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday things weren't quite as active? And then I would go on to say, well, you're going to lose 1/3 of your daycare. You're going to lose 40% of the organizations that provide welfare to work services. You're going to lose an enormous fraction of those that are involved in various transitional work programs or housing programs, affordable housing programs, or homeless shelters. Because these faith-based organizations are supplying these social services, and the vast majority of them are doing it without regard to anybody's religion. They are literally sort of sacred places, if you believe in that sort of thing, that serve civic purposes. And I would give that talk and so forth, and then as faith-based became sort of into the vernacular, into 2000, 2001, with President, or then Governor Bush and Vice President Gore both endorsing the idea in public policy terms, so-called charitable choice legislation and so forth, I would give that talk, and people would tend to buy it. And then I think something important happened in the country in 2005, which was indeed Katrina and New Orleans. And anybody who's looked at that thought experiment I used to talk about, happened for real. You woke up and they were gone. So were a lot of other institutions. But if you look at what's happened in the human, physical, and financial recovery process in New Orleans, and I've made about a dozen or so post-Katrina trips there and looking at it pretty closely, It's been the faith-based organizations. It's been those churches, synagogues, mosques, and so on, about 1,000 of which are back from the 1500 pre-Katrina, that have led that recovery process. It's been the big ones like Catholic Charities of New Orleans and Salvation Army and Habitat for Humanity, but it's also been ones you've never heard of. And it really is sort of a lesson in the importance of faith-based organizations to the whole service movement. You can't, by any measure, describe service in America without realizing that majority, whether it's in terms of membership or in terms of volunteer hours, comes from one or another kind of religious organization, as Professor Goldsmith's colleague, Professor Robert Putnam, has documented. So there, you can believe it. It came from a Harvard professor. But what is the importance of religion to service, and what are the varieties, if you will, of faith-based service and experience? We have a panel here that is just second to none in being able to speak to those issues. So without further ado, sister, if you would, lead us off.
Thank you. Show me a great religion that doesn't uphold service. I believe at the heart of all faiths there is a central core, and it is service. Just to mention a few of the people of faith who have inspired me over the years, who have called me and challenged me, they include Thomas Merton, Viktor Frankl, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Thich Nhat Hanh, and Julie Billiard, the founders of the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. And the Sisters of Notre Dame, our mission is to work with the poor toward empowerment. That is, to help the poor realize their God-given potential. And when we look out there in society, what we see, like AmeriCorps sees, the high dropout rate of students. We see isolation, alienation, problems with alcohol, drugs, and violence, lack of purpose and meaning, and suicide. So we want to help address these major problems that we see. And as we look around and we see how big they are and we see how small we are, we know we can't do it by ourselves. So we say, who can be our partner? And lo and behold, on the scene comes AmeriCorps. And I hear a speaker and I say, maybe. And then you get in line and say, how do you do this? And we find out about how to apply for AmeriCorps. And at the time, I was leading a small group of volunteers, 6 volunteers, and this looked like, and I had a request from our sisters for about 83 different volunteers around the country. And so how could we begin to address some of the requests that the sisters had placed before me, and how could we partner with AmeriCorps? And what we looked at were the values of the AmeriCorps and our values, and the values of working with the poor and education. 2 critical needs that we felt we could really work together on in a significant way. And so we submitted our grant, got the grant, and we do one-on-one tutoring, we do small group work with children, we do after-school homework clubs, cultural enrichment activities, and we involve parents and professionals in the school learning process. And we've helped students grow their self-esteem, we've helped them improve grade levels, and above all, we've worked with students in the 5th to 8th grade level where the dropout rate begins, and we focus on that age level, and we collaborate with Nativity Network, and we've been able to with these children, stem the movement toward dropping out of school and working with them and getting them have success in school, go on to high school, and now we're around long enough to work with them to get them into college. So I think our rate of success in the partnership with AmeriCorps, I couldn't begin to describe how happy we are with what we've been able to pull off through the work with AmeriCorps. But we don't stop there. I mean, working with the kids in the school, you got to also reach out and work with the parents. Well, what do the parents need? Well, many parents want to get their GED, or they need citizenship or life skill training, or they want job training. So we have this whole component really from Head Start to Adult Ed. There's no end to what we want to offer and help make possible so that everybody has a brighter future. And we have been partnering long enough with AmeriCorps that we can actually see that we're making a difference, and we celebrate that difference by going back to AmeriCorps and asking for more members. And what we have seen also in the process, not only and as many of you know who do have AmeriCorps, it's not only you're celebrating the fact that you're able to reach so many children and help with this grade level improvement and getting them in high school and college, but also it's the members themselves that are changed. You know, we've been well separated in society, right? And this gives a lot of young people just out of college a chance to be with economically poor kids in our cities and to get to understand some of the challenges facing economically poor children and adults, and to see what a life-size challenge it is for them, either to work with these kids and help them, or to work with adults and help them get a foot. If you ever tried to work with someone who needs to get a job, who's a parent and raise a family, just try it. It is one of the hardest jobs, and for these college students to have this experience and to go through it, it's incredible what they really learn from this. So they learn how to be tutors, mentors, they learn about the problems facing people, but all the while, they're building in their hearts and souls that ethic of service, not just for this year, but for life. So through AmeriCorps, we've been able to grow from 6 volunteers to 46, to 68, to 93. Today, we're 326 full-time volunteers. Last year, through AmeriCorps, we were able to send 15 volunteers to New Orleans to help with housing, but also to help in 2 schools. This year, we're able to launch a whole new program working with the children of prisoners, the whole mentoring program, because as you know, many of them will end up in prison. At least some of the stats out there say 70% of these children will end up in prison unless we do the preventive work now. So it ties in with what we were doing and what we hope to do in the future. But if it wasn't for AmeriCorps, see, and I'm trying to go after this money. I thought I heard last night that we didn't need the money. We do need the money.
Say it again, sister.
We do need the money.
One more time now.
The faith community needs the money.
Preach, sister.
If it wasn't for them, we would have closed down. I know about 12 small faith groups that have closed down in terms of the volunteers. If it wasn't for AmeriCorps, we wouldn't be 326 strong members. We wouldn't be working in 18 cities. We wouldn't have reached 200,000 children and adults across the country if it wasn't for AmeriCorps. So we're right on target at this conference, aren't we? Grow AmeriCorps, grow service in this country. And we want to be there with all the great leaders of this ServiceNation Summit and make a difference well into the future and grow the culture of service. And thank you for this opportunity to
Thank
share.
you, sister. Well, thank you, sister. You know, when I think I used to be afraid of nuns, I'm not afraid. Well, I'm a little afraid of you, but I love rabbis too. And Rabbi, I love the subtitle of one of your books, the part about creating communities of justice, which I think is one of the things that, at least in terms of aspiration, distinguishes faith-based social services in some sense. Not that secular folks aren't interested in justice, but it's a special part of, obviously, the Jewish tradition, of many other faith traditions. So if you could please just share us a little bit of your work.
I'd love to. Thank you. I'm intimidated, but also inspired.
There you go.
As John said, I'm the director of the Commission on Social Action of Reform Judaism, and in that capacity, I have the opportunity to facilitate the social justice work of our 900 congregations in North America. For Reform Jews, social action is a major pillar of our movement and our faith. You may have heard, we often refer to this as tikkun olam. It's a Hebrew phrase that has entered the regular parlance, which means repairing our broken world. Internally, we more often actually use the Hebrew word mitzvah to describe this work. In Hebrew, mitzvah means commandment. But I think as it has also entered the American language, it has come to mean more doing a good deed. I think that there's a significant difference between the real meaning of the word and how we've come to use it in general parlance. Anyone can commit an act of goodness, which is a wonderful and a noble thing, and I wouldn't suggest that it's better or worse than doing something as the fulfillment of a commandment as opposed to a good deed. But it is different. For a Jewish person, the pursuit of justice is an obligation. It's not an option. Caring for those who are vulnerable is perceived to be the fulfillment of our covenant with God. It is a way of living. For us, rolling up our sleeves, partnering with Habitat or any of the other wonderful organizations that are represented here, doing that work of fulfilling our mandate to improve the world is what it means for us to be partners with God in the ongoing and unfolding work of God's creation. So in fulfillment of this commandment, this mandate, the Reformed Jewish movement runs what we call mitzvah core programs, service programs for teens and adults, often, as I said, partnering with other faith communities, in some communities with churches, with mosques, with groups like Habitat for Humanity and others. When I describe a mitzvah core week, it's at least a week of combining the Jewish principles of Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim, which is study, worship, and acts of righteousness. So for a week, we are intensely involved and engaged in fulfilling those major pillars of Judaism and creating an inspiring work of living a Jewish life together as we pursue justice. Our camps and our religious schools engage our youth in hands-on service learning programs in order to inculcate within them a culture of service. Our congregations, as I said, join with others in interfaith volunteer programs, in faith-based community organizing, and in forming the great coalitions of decency that address many of the challenges that face our communities. I have to mention that there are others in the Jewish community, not just the Reformed Jewish movement, involved in this work. Organizations like the Jewish Coalition for Service, the American Jewish World Service, the Jewish Coalition for Literacy, the Jewish Funds for Justice, and I see my friend David Rosen here from an organization called Avodah, which is a year-long service learning program. There are wonderful opportunities for members of the Jewish community to be engaged in efforts to fulfill this mitzvah, this commandment, to be engaged in improving our world. I want to say just a word about the Gulf Coast, since it was mentioned before, and the faith community's role in recovery after Hurricane Katrina. And this is true not just for the Jewish community, but I think the faith community writ large. Utilizing our congregational networks, faith groups mobilized what I've been told was 250,000 volunteers and raised about $200 million in relief funds within the first 2 years after Hurricane Katrina. According to the Institute of Southern Studies, the value of faith-related labor, services, materials, and funds could be measured in the billions of dollars. That's not to suggest that we were the only ones doing volunteer work. And in fact, there were many civic groups in schools and universities and others who were intimately involved in volunteer efforts. But it was the faith community that was first on the scene, often well before government agencies found their way there, in part because we were already there. Evacuees sought shelter in church basements, in Jewish camps, in Muslim prayer halls. And in fact, as we speak, there are 600 Red Cross evacuees who are at our camp in Texas, sheltering evacuees from Hurricane Ike. As these local institutions that were doing the on-the-ground work, they reached out to the national faith networks in order to organize immediate response and get supplies and volunteers where they were needed. And as I think it was John said a few minutes ago, after the Red Cross left and after FEMA left, the faith community is still there, still working on behalf of these traumatized communities, still working where they are needed as the need is continuing. With God's help, we will continue to be where we are needed and to go where we are needed. And together, this is, I think, the message of the faith community. We will work to make real the vision that when the floodwaters come, they won't drown the poor and the weak. Instead, when the floodwaters come, they will raise all of our boats a little bit higher.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you. Thank you. Turning to Mayor Goldsmith now, I just have to say a quick word of preface, though. Prepare yourself. You know, I'm a political scientist by trade. I mean, that's what I get paid to do. I play one on TV. Not many people do. And there were a group of mayors in the 1990s in America. There was this great moment where we had mayors, Democrats and Republicans, who, it was just an extraordinary crop or class of mayors, and nobody in that class was more distinguished than Steve Goldsmith. Because not only on this issue, but to speak just to this issue, before it was fashionable, before it became a staple, which it now apparently is in presidential politics, and before people talked about it widely, he had already done it in Indianapolis, working in ways that no one had ever thought to work before with faith communities, with religious organizations, with religious nonprofits, with neighborhood organizations, and took those ideas and really shared them widely. He happens to be a Republican. I don't hold that against him. But he shared them in a way that made them a staple of thought, really, with people in both parties, people with different ideological proclivities. And so, Steve, eager to hear what you have to say, but I just want to thank you especially because I think in some sense the ideas that you were doing, not necessarily preaching in the 90s, have really begun to come to fruition more widely. So, Steve.
Thank you for your kind comments. Here's what I did to deserve this comment from John. So I read everything he ever wrote, then I applied what he wrote.
Well, I didn't say that.
And then he celebrated my good judgment, right? So, however I got to your good graces, I'm pleased to be there. Okay, so I'm also chairman of the Corporation National Community Service. And last night I heard everybody pledge to quadruple my budget. And Sister Catherine in the back of the room is the woman who runs the program, Kristen McSwain. Go ask her for more members as soon as we're finished, okay? She may be responsive. Let me do this just really quickly, just a couple issues, because we are now, gosh, John, I don't know, probably 15 years after I began this little experiment. So just about 2 minutes about why I got to where I was, and about 2 minutes now about how I think it fits into the service and corporation and AmeriCorps efforts. So I got elected mayor. I came out to visit, actually Baltimore, John, with Kurt Schmoke and Jim Rouse. And we went back to Indianapolis, and I thought I was going to copy what they were doing there. And I took 7 communities of 8,000 to 20,000 people each, which are the most neglected communities in Indianapolis, the most people were hurting the most. And we thought we'd do everything government could do to make those communities better off. And then about 3 years later, we looked at what was happening. We were spending enormous amounts of money. And some of the communities were working, some of the communities weren't, and we tried to figure out what the difference was between them. And unsurprisingly, the difference is where there was a local population that was highly invested and involved in serving their neighbors, those government tools were being effective, and where there weren't those neighborhood activities, the government tools were ineffective. So this kind of, at the time, it was during that period where Republicans were seeming to suggest if government would simply stop doing bad things, that these neighborhoods would be resurgent, and Democrats were suggesting more government activity would make the neighborhoods resurgent. So we rejected both sides of that equation, right, and said these two things have to come together. So we did an inventory of the assets in those neighborhoods, and again, unsurprisingly, the most frequent asset was the church, right? There were some, my synagogue had a little outreach effort, and there were a couple mosques, but basically it was the church, right? So then we said, how can we intentionally leverage the infrastructure of the faith groups, their memberships, and their physical assets in order to kind of make those communities work? How can we build those out? And then we began the process of rigorously scrubbing out the regulations that had discriminated against faith-based organizations. Now, these churches, as John has documented, were not the mega churches with 10,000 people. They were 400 people each, with a part-time pastor who had a job during the day and took care of the congregates at night and on the weekend. So we tried to figure out how we could leverage that. Now, let's move this forward a little bit. Now, then we start on the Corporation National Community Service effort about 7 years ago, and John begins in the faith-based office. And then how do these things come together? Well, obviously, the most frequent source of volunteers in this country today are faith-based groups, and that's part of the mission of all of the major religions that are represented here today. And also, then, there are many individuals, not all, but many individuals who are hurting, who benefit by a relationship that gives them confidence in themselves from a belief in a supreme being, right? So the goal then was to allow individuals to associate with faith-based organizations to deliver the areas where those faith-based organizations and government had a congruent interest. I'm trying to do all 10 years in like 4 minutes. So that meant we had to stop discriminating against those organizations, discriminating in what they were allowed to do, and discriminating against people who wanted to receive their services through them. So now we come up to the AmeriCorps period of time, and there are many more applicants for the AmeriCorps slots than there are available numbers. And then so you say, well, what is the role of the government, right? And you heard both senators respond to this last night, but let me just talk about Senator McCain's comments for a second. His comments reflected a legitimate tension on this issue, which is more government resources would definitely help the movement more, yet we need to be sensitive to grassroots organizations and the fact that this de Tocquevillian approach is what made America great. So what we've now tried to do in the last 8 years in Corporation Access Community Service is say that one of the most important criteria for assigning an AmeriCorps member to an organization is whether that leverages other volunteers, right? Does it pull other congregants through and into volunteerism? Does it throw other neighborhood people through? And wonderfully, we see that young adults who are at risk, who serve, right? We generally think about this model of good-hearted church folks serving at-risk kids, but we also see wonderful results when the at-risk kids are serving, right? Very, very significant kind of virtuous circle, if you'd say. So one of the criteria we now use for determining where the AmeriCorps slots should be allocated is thinking about them as the infrastructure for supporting volunteerism. They're 40-hour-a-week, really dedicated young men and women. So, John, I'd say that just kind of in closing, the model says that it's not government or faith or secular. It's the combination of the three. Government has distinct responsibilities to play. It needs to exercise those responsibilities in the service arena in a way that's supportive of Sister Catherine's efforts and Rabbi Feldman's efforts. And if we were fortunate enough to receive whatever that promises of riches we received last night, I think one could see deployment that benefits the faith community in its outreach in those neighborhoods.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Dr. Patel has done, I think, something that's impossible to do, which is he has taken an idea, in my humble estimation, of interfaith. Interfaith was always sort of, a priest and a rabbi and maybe an imam bump into each other at some event where you need a priest and a rabbi and an imam, and maybe they do something together after. But the intentional doing of things and focusing on a particular problem or population, in his case, youth, is really remarkable. And again, I couldn't more strongly commend it to you, but now we have something better than the words on the page or on the internet. We have himself. So, Dr. Patel.
Thank you. Somebody this morning quoted Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes saying that, may you live in the passion of your times. And the passion of my times when I went to college in 1993 was the service movement. Vanessa Kirsch, Wendy Cobb, Alan Casey, the people who are at the forefront of what we're watching today, were at the beginnings of what they were starting back then. And they changed my life. And I stopped talking about a career, and I started talking about a calling. And I spent a summer doing service in Catholic worker houses, and I became a teacher after college. And I didn't go through the Teach for America program. It was the idea that Wendy Cobb and others put in the culture, which diverted me from kind of a very straight into law school and into kind of a corporate career route into a service path. My parents at one point were like, we immigrated from India for this. But I just want to say that being at ServiceNation feels a little bit like having arrived on the moon in the Kennedy sense. I feel like what happened in 1993 when these organizations were just starting was they were pointing to a vision. I mean, what was remarkable about them was they didn't frame it as we have 500 kids going into schools to teach. They framed it as idealism versus cynicism. It was the biggest frame possible. It was like Kennedy saying we're going to the moon in 10 years. So I feel like we've arrived on the moon, and what's remarkable is that these people are saying, now we're going to Mars, right? We're going further, and we get to be a part of that. It's an amazing privilege, I think. I want to talk about the two types of service movements that were most prominent in my college years in the mid-1990s. One was the faith and service movement, the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, the Lutheran Volunteer Service. My friend David Rosen was just starting the Jewish Volunteer Service. The Muslim Public Service Network was getting started in the 1990s. And I watched my friends from different religious communities go into these faith-based volunteer corps. And the second was, of course, the Teach for Americas, the City Years, and the Public Allies, which were extremely intentional about engaging diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, class diversity, geographic diversity. Where was the religious diversity? Where was the idea of bringing people from different religious communities together to serve others? And in the faith-based volunteer corps, where was they of course connected faith and service, but there wasn't the idea of diversity amongst faiths. And so I kind of saw this youth service learning diversity movement having the absence of faith, and I saw this faith-based service movement having the absence of diversity. And at the same time, a guy from that H school up in Cambridge wrote a little book called The Clash of Civilizations, where he articulated that the post-Cold War era would be defined by acrimonious relationships between different religious communities. And he basically says that, that civilizations are based on religious traditions, and religious traditions are inherently and inevitably at odds with each other, right? And so what I'm watching is these amazing forces for social good not engage religious diversity directly, and effectively then forfeit that terrain to other paradigms, to other ways of thinking. And I'm thinking to myself, as you said, sister, that my heroes are people of faith who have started service movements, and they're from all different faith backgrounds. They're the same heroes as you have. Buddhists like Thich Nhat Hanh, Hindus like Mahatma Gandhi, Muslims like Malcolm X and Fareed Essek and the Aga Khan, Jews like Abraham Joshua Heschel, Catholics like Dorothy Day, Protestants like Jane Addams, right? And I'm thinking to myself, all of these people were about service, right? Why are we ignoring that amazing animating force in terms of the real world? Why aren't we setting something up that takes advantage of that? Why not effectively an interfaith youth corps, right? And so I kind of complained about this enough to where at some point people were like, look, if you think this is really important, if you want to start a Jesuit volunteer corps that has Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, etc., if you want to start a city year which has the same thing, why don't you just do it? Why don't you make the idea reality? And this was at the same time that the social entrepreneurship movement was kind of coming out of the water, and there was this profound feeling of empowerment of if you have an idea, you can actually do something with it. I want to say one more thing about, I think, the importance of this on the landscape, and then just say a word or two about what my organization, the Interfaith Youth Corps, actually does, which is another colleague of Professor Diolio's from that H school up in Cambridge, Robert Putnam, says in a book 10 years ago called Bowling Alone that religious communities are probably the single most important source of social capital in America, the single most important source of, as you said, service, volunteerism, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he came out with a new book about a year ago, which has a startlingly disturbing data point or set of data points, that he says that diversity and social capital are actually inversely correlated. In other words, the more diverse a neighborhood, an apartment complex, a campus, whatever it might be, the less trust, the less volunteerism, the less rates of voting. Okay, now take that and multiply it by 100, and that's the situation we have with religious diversity in America today. Because at least these other forms of diversity, race, gender, class, ethnicity, sexuality, geography, at least they're on the table. At least they're being discussed. At least the city years of the world said it's important for us to have those different backgrounds together in our programs. Religious diversity isn't even discussed, which effectively means it's forfeited to the forces of division. Okay? So America is the most religiously diverse country in human history and the most religiously devout nation in the West at a time of global religious conflict. At a moment when the Clash of Civilizations paradigm is the dominant way of thinking about interreligious relationships. Right? We live, that's a tinderbox. Every set of religious conflicts happening in the world today, diaspora groups of those communities live here, oftentimes in the same neighborhood. The news of the Middle East affects Jewish-Muslim relations here. News of Northern Ireland affects Catholic-Protestant relations here. unless we are deliberate about moving this in a different direction, again, we forfeit that terrain, right? So what does that look like? I actually think it's not that hard. It's this sense that I think down the line we've been saying that you take a common value between different faiths and you say, let's stand together and act on that. It's the animating spirit of the Interfaith Youth Corps. And the way we work is to go train young people to start their own interfaith projects, their own interfaith service projects, a day of interfaith youth service, an interfaith student council, an interfaith arts project, and then network those young people and say, collectively, this could be a movement. This could be a movement of young people working together to build religious pluralism. And last night, I kind of, the standard was set really, really high. But I think to myself, America with its kind of city on a hill image, with the sense that that city on a hill has always had a steeple in the center of it, right? The Winthropian image is a biblical one after all. Well, that steeple is now surrounded by the minaret of a mosque, the Hebrew script of a synagogue, the chanting of a Buddhist sangha, the statues of Hindu temples. We exist in a new city on a hill, a new religiously diverse city on a hill. How are those institutions going to relate to each other? And I think that what we need to say is America is not just about liberty, it's not just about opportunity, it's not just about equality, but America in the 21st century is about religious pluralism. We are going to be the new city on a hill. We are going to model this for a world that is increasingly convinced that religious conflict is inevitable. And in 10 years, I would like this movement that we are trying to catalyze right now to have reached a point where we can have two presidential candidates who get on stage and basically agree with each other, right? And we can have thousands of people, including significant philanthropists at the table saying, if we don't invest in religious pluralism as a way to mobilize some of the most important assets in this country, then we're in deep danger of forfeiting those assets to people who would move them in different directions.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I actually thought of Dr. Patel's work. Penn, as President Gutman mentioned, one of the things we've done is we've sent a lot of students, over 1,000 weeks of service, down to the post-Katrina Gulf, in particular New Orleans. And a group of our students at the Penn Hillel Center and a group of our students at the Muslim Students Association came together around spring break and said they wanted to go down together, do interfaith dialogue, but also do a service project together. So being a good university bureaucrat, I said, that's fine, that's great, warms my heart, but you have to have a name so I could put it and give you a C-ref and put it in the budget. So they gave themselves a name. They called themselves MAGIC, for Muslims and Jews in cahoots. Which we thought was very funny till it hit the newspapers, hit the daily papers, and they both took a little heat. But you talk about, when I heard David Gergen mention, are we going to be able to mobilize 250,000 kids for young people for AmeriCorps and these other large mobilization numbers, given the fact that we're going to have these tens of billions of dollars now that Mayor Goldsmith's going to tend to and so forth. I thought of Tim Shriver, because during his 11 years with the Special Olympics, he recruited a few people, like 1.5 million new athletes around the world, not just here in the U.S. And Special Olympics, it's the household word, and it is obviously something of incredible importance. But operating in more than 180 countries, I mean, doing this on a global scale, I think it gives us hope and inspiration, Tim, to think of being able to do service and mobilize and organize on that scale. So without further ado, Tim.
Thank you. Well, Muslims, Jews, and cahoots, that would make me a cahoot, I guess.
You're a cahoot.
Although I aspire to the goodness of Jews and Muslims, I'm not one, so I guess I'm a cahoot. But I want to just pick up on Dr. Patel's comments, because a lot of what he said is what I'd like to say. The issue that I'm interested in surrounds the issue of human dignity and tolerance. And in the family I grew up in, tolerance was sometimes figuring out how to get along with your cousins and brothers and sisters at the dinner table. But as we've gotten older, we have relied increasingly on one another, and so I want to thank my cousin Caroline for timing her entry here for my remarks, so that if nobody else clapped, I'd at least have one person. And following this panel is not easy to get applause, and I'm very grateful. And of course, we all admire and love Caroline. And yeah, I'm a little tired of it, to be honest with you, but no, it's there. But I did grow up, I think it is relevant that I grew up in a family, and I think a huge amount of what people have talked about in this conference, in this last 24 hours, is how do we encourage young people, how do we make it possible for young people to grow up in contexts where service isn't a separate activity, where care and compassion aren't considered separate vocations from one's regular day-to-day life, where the ideals of working for peace and justice aren't corollaries to one's career, but are central to one's living. And I, just through chance, really, grew up in a setting where all those things were very much, I would say, obligations in good Judeo-Christian tradition. We were all raised in an environment where it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to work at a summer camp with children with special needs. It was a lot of fun to campaign. It was a lot of fun to visit Peace Corps sites. It was a lot of fun to go to special needs schools. It was a lot of fun to do all these things. And we look back on it and we all kid about it and we think, what on earth were we doing as we were being traipsed around by our parents through all these various activities? But it was an extraordinary experience, and I think if we could encourage parents and schools to simply create contexts where the ideals of service were fun, really, because kids want to have fun, kids want to play, kids want to do things they enjoy, kids want to hang out, they want to do stuff that's fun. And the more we can pitch this work, the more we can pitch the work of compassion and care as the work of recreation and joy, and really talk about the bright side. The prophets do this very beautifully, the ones that I'm familiar with. They speak of giving and giving and giving, and then your light breaks forth like the dawn. Then your midnight is like the noonday. Then you walk around and everything is full of joy and possibility. And I think too frequently the service world talks about the burden and the duty and the guilt and the obligation, and not so appealing to young people, but the fun is. So, and I think that's, kind of a serious point. But let me come back here just to one or two quick points on the panel. I think I'm not an expert in the faith-based movement, but when I hear people talk about it, what I'm hearing is religiously based work. I'm hearing that we have to find ways to mobilize the resources of religiously based organizations to deliver services. And I certainly would never argue with that. I think it's a fantastic thing. Ending the discrimination against religiously based organizations that can deliver services to people who need them is absolutely essential. And I think we have a bipartisan consensus on that due to the work of John and Mayor Goldsmith and others over the last 15, 20 years. The sticking point, though, as I understand it, is the issue of discrimination. And this is where there's some differences of opinion between the parties about whether there should be allowed faith-based tests for employment. And so it comes back right away to the Achilles heel of religion. And the Achilles heel of religion, as Dr. Patel has said, is that sometimes it separates people. Sometimes it balkanizes people. Sometimes it puts people into camps, one against the other. And most services, even in religious institutions, spend a lot of ritual time complimenting those people who pursue the particular religion that is in the house, and marginalizing in some way or creating second-class citizens of those who are not. Now, this may not be a nice thing to say in this audience, because I think in this audience we all want to be rah-rah for religion, and certainly I believe very strongly in the power and importance of religion and spirituality, but I do think the question is not so much around religion, but around spirituality. And I think really, in a way, this is what Dr. Patel is saying. I would argue that we are in a spiritual age, that the heroes that Sister referred to today include people you would add to the heroes of the spirit, the Viktor Frankls and the Dorothy Days of the world. You would add Oprah. Now, she's not a religious figure, but she inspires a lot of spiritual search and a lot of spiritual fulfillment and a lot of spiritual hunger. Now, that may sound tacky and unorthodox and kind of tinny to say in a very serious audience like this, but I believe that men and women, young people and old people, are very much hungering for spiritual satisfaction. They are very much hungering for yoga. Yoga's growing faster than most religions. Now, you could say yoga is a religion and yoga is a religious discipline, but it's not traditionally a religion in the way we in the West think about it. What's the point? I think the point is that we do need a common language, a common spiritual language of service that transcends religious confession, if you will, confessional differences, and provides a context where the whole disciplines of spirituality, those disciplines which promote quiet, a sense of peace, a sense of recollection, a sense of self-awareness, a sense of withdrawal, and uses that sense of dignity and self-awareness that comes from a spiritually focused way of living to work for justice, to work for peace, to stop at nothing, to give, and then when you're tired of giving and you're afraid of giving, to give more. That comes, in my view, not just from denominational conviction, but from spiritual conviction. And the underlying message of spiritual conviction is that everybody matters. And the underlying gift of the Spirit is that you can't tolerate the violation of the Spirit in anyone when you discover it in yourself. And so I look at the front row here at Soren Palumbo and Clint Armistead, 2 volunteers in the Special Olympics movement, both sophomores in college, both people who have given enormous amounts of time to simple acts of service, not in a denominational way, not in a Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or a Buddhist tradition, but simply because, in my view, and I'm putting this onto them, they have found in their lives a sense of dignity in themselves that they will not allow to be violated in someone else. They just won't let it happen. So they will stop other kids from using the word retard, for instance, a recent effort of ours. Not because it's politically correct, but because they feel it is a violation of dignity. It's humiliating to somebody. It's an absolute robbing of someone's sense of hope and possibility. And once you find that sense in yourself, you can't allow it to be taken from someone else. So you go to New Orleans, yes, because you have a confessional commitment, but mostly because you cannot stand the idea of someone suffering unjustly. Because it's you. Because the Spirit is universal. Because you will not allow the dignity of the human family, the dignity of the human person to be taken from someone because you feel it's taking it from yourself. Now, I'm not sure exactly the relevance for a public policy debate, but I do believe that what we're seeing in the public policy debate in both candidates for the major parties is a sense, this authenticity discussion. This question is who's more authentic, who's more about change, which I think is real, I think is pointing us to new paradigms of service, political, public, religious, faith-based, and spiritually based service, where the ideals of a common ground of spirituality form the underpinnings not just of service delivery, where we're feeding the hungry or housing the homeless, but where we're connecting to people, ending intolerance, fighting barriers that separate people from one another, and most pointedly, perhaps, fighting barriers that separate people of faith from one another because of their confession. And if we focus on those common core projects, as Dr. Patel is doing, and we look at the ways in which religiously based action can become spiritually based grounding in a common core language, then I think we have a new frontier of possibilities in political life, in religious life, and in the NGO world. And you don't have to wear a cross or carry a religious symbol or have a confessional commitment to carry that kind of spirit with you. It can come from many types of NGOs that carry the kind of work that Soren and Clint are doing through our particular organization, but there are hundreds of them, and we're not any different. When we tap that spirit, watch out, you can go to India and in 3 years recruit 300,000 Special Olympics athletes in rural communities, all with volunteers, all without cash. And you've got young men and women going out and trying with soccer balls to open the doors of possibility to moms and dads who have kept their children locked in closets, not even closets, with animals because they're different, because out of fear that their children didn't matter. And all you have to do is tell those people, with that soccer ball, you can uncover and recognize the dignity of a child who today is being told, whose mother is being told, you may never be proud of yourself or your son or your daughter. And then you just stand back and watch. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Man, I hope we got every word of that on tape, Mr. Tape Guy. I hope we got that because I want to go over that. I really do. And let me just, I want to open it up to the audience as time allows. I know we got a late start, but I want to pick up right where Tim brought us, because I think you put your finger, Tim, on the issue, at least from the standpoint of the public policy discourse or debate or discussion. Because, we'll leave here and you can feel, we can sing Kumbaya and everybody can go away happy, but the reality is, as I had a little experience with, thanks to Mr. Goldsmith, there are people who can, talk only so far and get up to that point about religious hiring rights and so forth, and then the discussion turns pretty nasty. And it does get back to the notion of what are we about here? Our patron saint at the University of Pennsylvania is Ben Franklin, Saint Ben. To pour forth benefits for the common good is divine. To pour forth benefits for the common good is divine. You know, religion is to do good to man, period. Now, that's one perspective. Faith without works is dead is a, fits me because I'm a, working class Catholic kid who grew up and sister told me to say that, so I said it. But the reality is not everybody feels that way. And we do have right now, hanging over this entire discourse, the question of, what are the two candidates saying about religious hiring rights? If we go down the path that Dr. Patel has given us, we're not going to have any problems. I mean, at least in those terms, because interfaith-based organizations, people come in together, the partner, public, private, religious, secular, interfaith, ecumenical, to focus on at-risk youth, to provide housing, to provide job training, we're not going to have a problem. So if I'll just throw it open to the panel, anybody wants to speak to it, what would you say? I mean, given that religion can be a toxic or a tonic, and this issue turns it into a bit of a toxic, what would you say? What would your advice be on how to handle this question of religious hiring rights? Should you be able to hire only people who share your particular religious beliefs and tenets if you take punt penny one of public money? Mayor Goldsmith? Not that you're speaking for the McCain campaign, we understand that, but please do keep that tape rolling.
Thanks, John, for calling on that. I appreciate it. Tim was motivating and convincing, and so I'm ready to sign up. Do I have to go ahead and answer the question?
You do indeed.
Okay. I predictably kind of disagree. I agree with the analysis that Tim went through, but to me, government should be respectful of the institutions that it is partnering with. And today, as we know, faith-based organizations are allowed to hire co-religionists. They can't discriminate against those to whom they provide services. Talking under your, you're the expert on this, but since you called on me, I'll answer the question anyway. But government can't tell them that they have to hire non-Catholics or non-Jews. Now, that can play out in unpleasant ways or not, but I think that if we are going to have an infrastructure that supports faith-based organizations, then we need to not discriminate against them. And we don't tell other organizations who they can or cannot hire on principles. And I don't think we should tell faith-based organizations that they have to hire folks that are not of their faith. That can play out in uncomfortable ways, but I think that's the respectful role of government. That's what it should be.
Tim and Tim, did you want to, Rabbi, do you want to jump in there?
No.
Tim, I'll let you back clean up, then we'll go to the audience. I'll let you back clean up.
I don't know if what I'm about to say is going to be controversial in this room or not, but I think the answer is yes. Sectarian faith-based organizations should be able to hire who they want, and I do not think the government should fund a sectarian organization. We have very strong feelings about separation of church and state. I think the government should not be funding sectarian organizations. I think there is plenty of non-sectarian faith-based organizations out there doing great work that government should fund. Jewish Family Services, Catholic Relief Services, Lutheran Family Services. These are organizations inspired by their faith traditions who have formed non-sectarian institutions in order to be able to serve the entire community with their values fully intact, but the cost of receiving government funds is they also have to follow the rules, which means they have to not discriminate in their hiring. So I think that there's plenty of room for supporting faith-based service. As a sectarian organization, I believe in sectarian faith-based service, but I wouldn't take government funds for it, which is why when our camps open their doors to evacuees, we don't take government dollars. The Red Cross will pay us the same thing it pays any other shelter, but we won't take government money for our infrastructure of that camp because it's a sectarian institution.
Tim, did you want to?
Well, yeah, I would just say, it may be a kind of a silly thing to say, but I don't think government should force anybody to do anything. I think this is in the interest of the religious organizations. I mean, look, I have 5 kids raised Catholic. My tradition is going to lose all 5 of them unless it is better able to articulate a common ground of respect and dignity for other faiths than it has so far been able to do, in my opinion. Now, So I'm not saying that the government should necessarily bring the heavy hand here, although I would agree with what the rabbis pointed out. I think it should be in the interest of the faith-based leaders. The faith-based leaders need to do for religion what Franklin and Jefferson did for politics, which was to allow a common ground of conscience to separate itself from authority, have its own space, and encourage. The church I go to in Chevy Chase, Maryland, ought to have the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Jews that are within 2 blocks of each other, working together on a Saturday afternoon if they're going to do Habitat or if they're going to do Special Olympics, or as they do frequently. Not because the government tells them they have to, but out of, in my opinion, I believe their selfish interest for establishing the credibility of their spiritual message.
So now we're in violent agreement.
Oh, okay, all right. It sounds like, unfortunately, that's the case. Yes, we are in violent
I can
agreement.
be disagreeable too.
No, I mean, I agree. I totally agree.
I hear you. No, I'm serious. I
Totally
wasn't
agree
being.
with that proposition.
Sister, do you want to say a word, and then we're going to throw this thing
Yes,
wide open?
I do think the problem is not just in this area. I just think it relates to the whole thing if we've been well separated. I mean, we have no African American people on this panel. I mean, so often in the service movement, that is a big question in terms of members. I mean, just to give, that on that level, and it's, again, I want to come back to appreciating AmeriCorps and our partnership with them, forcing us to grow beyond where we were. And I think it relates to what you're saying. It's a big help to move beyond your small worlds, but we have to do it on many levels.
Amen. Amen. All right. So we are going to, thank you, Sister, and we're going to the audience. Sir.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for everything that's been said so far. I want to add another aspect to the complexity of diversity with also some sense of your religious heritage intact, which is that Abraham Joshua Heschel said no religion is an island, right? And he also said that so we have to be in working partnership with each other. But he also said you can't do interfaith without faith. And
That's
so
right.
for many of our folks, the issue is that they themselves are not really that well schooled in the faith tradition. So that, sort of send them forth and say, be in interfaith settings can sometimes be challenging. I think, Ibu can tell you about how his program deals effectively with that particular challenge, but I'll just say, I run a year-long full-time faith-based service corps program called Avodah, and our folks come in their ages 21 to 26, and not only is what they're, and they work all over the place in lots of different settings, but what's happening for them during the program is their own formation. And for us, as a Jewish program, that's a serious thing. We want them to use that year as a way to develop their own understanding of who they are as citizens, yes, but also as Jews. And that complicates our ability to connect with government structures. So can you speak to the way in which...
The young lady in the back is giving me the cut sign so we could be brief. And we will be around so we can mill and talk as we go to wherever we're going next. But please, who would like to take that and respond? Ibu?
I'll take that quickly, yes. So I was, David, I agree with you. I was inspired by what Tim said. I also am a little troubled by it, and I'll because of what you said. I think how you affirm people's identities is enormously important in this country and around the world. And the most salient identity for the vast majority of humankind is their religious identity. And while I think that there is a powerful spiritual movement afoot, which has service as a big part of it, if that movement is viewed as a threat to people's particularist religious identities, I think that is going to be potentially a problem, right? So I think the way that we...
I agree with that.
So the way that, I think the practical dimension of this is that there are very concrete vessels for social capital, and they're called faith communities. And so when Mayor Goldsmith goes to neighborhoods in Indianapolis, there might well be kind of a spiritual ethos in the air, which is, moving towards something positive. But over in that building, on that corner, there are 400 people who gather every Sunday morning, and you can put shovels in their hands, and that's a very concrete thing, right? And that is multiplied in a gazillion ways across America, and that's the kind of Tocquevillian ideal. So the way that we articulate this at the Interfaith Youth Corps is with the term pluralism. And we think pluralism can be articulated in kind of a one-line poetic statement, which is, how do you build a society where people from different backgrounds live in equal dignity and mutual loyalty? And you can break that down into 3 component parts. One is, how are you respectful of people's identities, recognizing that their Catholicness, their Jewishness, their Muslimness is absolutely central to who they are. And as the rabbi was saying, I feel commanded to do this out of a 5,000-year-old heritage, right? That is the deepest part of who I am. So a pluralism that, number 1, respects identities, number 2, encourages positive relationships between people from different backgrounds, and number 3, has a commitment to the common good. And what I want to actually end with is, I don't think, Harris Wofford this morning talked, and Jeff Sachs were saying, it's important that what we did in the 1960s was not called the Development Corps, it was called the Peace Corps. And it was peace through service. And I want to just say, I think there's 2 public policy dimensions to this. I think there's a social capital dimension in terms of mobilizing social capital, but there's a very clear peace and security dimension to this also. Okay? If you look around the world, the societies in which there is profound instability and violence are societies that do not have pluralism. Societies where there is peace and stability are societies that have pluralism, and it cleaves along those 3 vectors: identity, relationships, common good. Okay? In diverse societies like the United States, where you have respect for identity, you have relationships between different communities, you have a commitment to the common good, it's called America, you have a sense of stability. In societies like, for example, some of the news stories you hear out of Iraq, and this is not a political statement at all, but one has to ask oneself the question, do Sunni Shias and Kurds feel a sense that their identity is respected, number 1? Number 2, are there relationships between those communities? And number 3, is there an Iraq? Is there a common good? So I think that this is this has profound implications for the 21st century for domestic issues and foreign policy issues.
Well, I want to thank you, and hardly any better possible way we could end. And I just want to thank Sister, thank Rabbi, thank the Mayor, thank Dr. Patel, and thank Chairman Shriver. Please join me in thanking them.